Welcome everyone, Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to discuss something that came up in a conversation I was having with a client earlier today. He was posing an interesting question, and that is, have there ever been cases where countries have started to decline aggressively? He was specifically referring to Australia, but you could look at many different places, and they have managed to come out of it. And I think it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. You know, are these trends at some point irreversible, or is it a situation where you actually can go through a cycle and come out the other side? And I think sometimes we tend to have a framing bias or a recency bias where we're kind of looking at the immediate period that we're around, and we don't have the ability to zoom out and see like, hey, well, what does history really tell us? So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss what things have been like in the past, where things have, I mean, clearly they've gotten much worse in some situations, but have there been cases where they have gotten better? And where are we on this whole gradient of experience? So let's dive in and talk about it today. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Welcome, I'm Michael from Offshore Citizen. We're some of the foremost international tax and relocation specialists. If you're interested in any of that and paying the lowest legal amount of tax possible, relocating to other countries, setting up international corporate structures and trusts and foundations and banking and all these kinds of things, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendar.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. So as I was saying, in the moment, I think it can seem really catastrophically bad, right? COVID was probably like one of the best examples where for a lot of people their entire lifetime, they'd never seen something like the restrictions that came about during COVID. And it seemed really jarring and concerning and all this sort of stuff. And I think it was jarring and concerning on a whole bunch of different levels. This being said, if we look at it historically, it's not as though a lot of those things have never happened before. And the most obvious time when that's been the case is wartime, right? If you were to look at what was going on during World War II, World War I, again, depending where we are in the world, you had a lot of restrictions. There was rationing of specific goods. Things were basically seized, et cetera, et cetera. And travel was restricted for people. They couldn't go where they wanted in the same way. There was drafts in a lot of cases, right? You were literally forced to go to war. Obviously, if you were on the German side, people were brought to concentration camps. That was pretty horrible. Literally, they would say that, the kind of orcs and goblins and things from a fantasy film is like practically what was happening, almost like literally happening, like people were being put in ovens. It doesn't really get much worse than that, right? Genocide is probably the height of severity. But even if you were in somewhere else, I mean, there was internment of the Japanese in Canada, which seems crazy, right? It's like really a blight on Canadian history and Canadian legacy. There's lots of restrictions, lots of things that you would think, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening in a democratic, civilized, supposedly free country. And so it's easy to, in the moment, feel like that's crazy. We look back at that historically and we say, well, that was kind of justified because of, it was a world war, et cetera. But let me ask you, in the history books, when people look back at COVID, what are you going to be taught? In school, they're probably going to say, well, it was justified. There was this global pandemic, et cetera, right? But it's easy to have it justified to you in retrospect. But what was it really like for you at the moment? I mentioned in a previous video that one of the things that I found quite interesting was reading the Einstein biography and reading about the experiences that he went through during kind of the period in World War I specifically, but just in general around that time, what it was like crossing borders, how there were restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one of the areas that was discussed there, and I think really fits nicely into our kind of conceptualizing what's going on, and maybe gives a degree of optimism. I think there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic, right? It doesn't take much. I think there's a lot of YouTube channels and people out there who like to spread fear and gloom and kind of probably exaggerate and go after, it's like how many times have people said, the US dollar is about to collapse, the US is about to collapse, the end of Western civilization, et cetera. And it hasn't happened yet. At some point it will, but not yet. And so I think it sells magazines, it gets clicks to say these sensationalist headlines, but if you're really rational about it, probably not quite that extreme. The worst outcome rarely happens, the best outcome rarely happens. You tend to get some median outcome. Probably doesn't get you clicks to say that, but anyway, that is what it is. One of the things that might give optimism though, as much as you can say whether this is optimistic, was, I didn't, obviously, I'm quite young compared to, I didn't grow up during World War II, but in the post-World War II era, there was the McCarthy era. And it was interesting to hear and read a little bit about the McCarthy era. I'd encourage you to go and check it out, because this was the period sort of after World War II when there was really kind of like a witch hunt for communists in the US. And there was a lot of behavior by the government that really would seem not proper. Now, they had less tools than they do today, right? There's a funny meme I saw the other day, which was NSA the only government agency that actually listens to you. And, so you get that kind of thing, that there's clearly more tools and things in place. But what I find reassuring is that we went through the McCarthy era and we came out the other side and things were more free and open and there was options and we kind of got to a better place in that given country. And so if you look at places like Australia, places like Germany, places like UK, you may find and feel like, oh man, my freedoms are being restricted. There's problems coming in here. This is not like what I believe in. This is not what I want. Maybe you are somebody who it is what they want, but a lot of people it's not. And that might give you a sense of gloom and feeling like this is permanent. And it might be permanent. Like I think, these things, you move through these things not deterministically, but through the power of individual agency of people kind of taking action and moving the world towards the world that they want to have. And that's far, far from guaranteed. But we have gone through all kinds of things in the past. And that gives hope that actually it's not like you've always had this irresistible decline. I mean, even if you look at, people will sit there and they'll say things like, oh, every fiat currency has collapsed. Now, of course, what that really means is everyone except the existing ones have collapsed. But if you look at when a country has, say, lost its dominant dollar status, dominant currency status, world reserve currency status, not dollar, you could look at something like, okay, so the Spanish were kind of the leading empire and they got usurped by, the Dutch, who got usurped by the British, and who got usurped by the Americans. In each of these cases, the collapse was not that calamitous. Right? It's not like when the Roman Empire fell apart and you had this, centuries of dark ages that happened. Clearly, some of that has happened throughout history. But, the decline of the British Empire, although it was a significant geopolitical shift, didn't mean the end of the world for the British Empire. Right? The British Empire is kind of still existing in one shape or form or another. People in UK are still fairly okay. Is the British pound what it used to be? No, it's not. But, has it led to complete ruin? Like, is the path that these nations go down naturally extreme hyperinflation? No. Extreme hyperinflation tends to be pretty rare, fortunately, right? Gradually as the purchasing power decline, yes. Will it continue to decline in the other places? Yes, this is going to happen. But is it calamitous? Far from certain. Far from certain. And we have seen cases where there have been problems. So, for example, if I go to some major Western cities these days, I see a lot of homelessness, right? There's just like a bunch of problems. Well, guess what? New York City during the 80s was pretty bad, like quite dangerous, lots of problems, etc. Then they managed to turn it around. That's optimistic. If you go to a bunch of different places, they have had breakdowns. And yeah, sometimes it takes decades for it to recover, but it has recovered in many cases. So I don't think that it is an entirely one-dimensional vector that is leading you down an irresistible path in all cases. Now, I do think that sometimes there are deep structural problems. I did a video a while ago talking about in the US, like what I believe about the structural problems that have occurred. And I describe it as democracy is not capable of solving the problems that democracy has created. That's kind of unfortunate. But I don't think that that has to be the case in any given circumstance. I think you have to really look specifically at what's going on in any given place and evaluate it. Because look, like the rebuilding of Germany after World War II was pretty phenomenal. The rebuilding of Japan after World War II was pretty phenomenal. History is full of these stories of nations that have declined and then come back. I mean, China was it was the global leader in many things for a long time and then had a very long period of decline and now is, arguably number 2 in the world, number 1 across many different areas of science and technology and development and growth, etc. It's a message that I think if you're really willing to step back and look at history, and a lot of people will attack their biases and they won't like that and they're going to by default reject it, etc. But if you're willing to step back and look, you can see the arc that things do not only go up or only go down. They do go through these cycles. And I think that some countries are much more likely to have those positive cycles than others. But overall, we are far from the point, in most of the places I think that people would want to live, that it is beyond repair and beyond redemption. Doesn't mean it will, but I think there's some promise there. So I would love to hear from you guys which places you think kind of show most signs of redemption and growth and turning it around, or which ones on the flip side have most chances of just irresistibly plunging into a much worse fate over, let's just call it over the next 10 or 15 years or something. And we can compare notes in the comments below. So let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you on the next video.